I am an activist, and that's why I've been called to speak to you here today. I've been an activist since I was 15 years old. I started working with the Canadian Red Cross, focusing on global issues, and I was so passionate, and I could talk for hours and hours about child soldiers and small arms sales and fair trade. And I ran a global issues club at my school that was a big part of my life. This was in high school. And my global issues club would do events like we'd have bake sales where we'd have little gingerbread men with one leg or one arm cut off to symbolize the limbs taken from landmine victims. And so we do really effective things like that. We ran all sorts of workshops and facilitations and camps and different types of events. And then after that, I moved on to international activism, and that's what I do now. I'm in my final year of university, and I focus on international climate change negotiations. And I've had the wonderful opportunity to travel the world, and I've been to South Africa and Qatar and Mexico, and I've worked with amazing youth and NGOs, and basically my whole life has been a whirlwind of caring deeply about these issues and working nonstop to do something about them. So I've been wondering lately, is that what makes me an activist, my track record of activism? And I decided that what I'm really here to talk to you about is what that word means. What is activism in our chaotic and globalized world, or fast-paced world today? And really, I'd like to say that I have a problem with the way that we define activism in today's world and the way we practice activism. So let's move into it. What is it? Activism can look like this. You know, hundreds of thousands of people rallying for a cause in solidarity. Or activism can look like this. One person refusing to give up her seat in what was labeled the white section of the bus, Rosa Parks. In my definition of activism, it is the practice of addressing an issue, any issue, by challenging those in power. And this can take so many different forms. In my work, it is an act performed by civil society, that's us, outside of government, towards those in the system of governance. Sorry, that got cut off. But what I've come to realize is that activism is so diverse, and this definition can span so many different forms, some of them silent, and some of them quite loud. I engage in activism because I desire to see a world where there's justice, economic, environmental, and social justice. And I would actually argue that that's the bottom line for most, or if not every, form of activism. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the golden rule, right? The golden rule is do unto others as you would have done unto yourselves. And I know that I grew up with that, and that was definitely a principle for me to live by, and probably many of you as well. What's interesting about the golden rule is that it's actually been found in one form or another in many of the most ancient civilizations, which is really interesting because it goes to show that if different races and different civilizations all had this idea simultaneously or at different times, it goes to show that somewhere deep within us there is a drive for justice, and there's a drive to know that a good society means a just and equal society. So that's what I strive for, and I honestly have faith in us as a human race, because I believe that if you're looking at someone who has a problem, if you're looking at an issue or someone's suffering, something within you wants to fix that injustice, something within you, and I call that compassion. And compassion's within all of us. None of us is exempt from it, which means that everyone can be an activist. So what do I mean by everyone can be an activist? Well, in 1999, in Seattle, the World Trade Organization, big bureaucratic institution run by a small group of probably mostly white men in suits running the lives of the rest of the world, came together to have its ministerial conference in a big secretive building in Seattle. And this conference was very hush-hush, and they were laying out a plan for globalization to unfurl in the 21st century. And 50,000 people showed up from all over the world, all different kinds of people from different walks of life, to protest this very secret governance process. and they actually shut it down. The whole meeting was canceled, and they couldn't move forward because people had stood up for what they knew was right and stood together against that. Now, on the other hand, I have a friend who is a doctor. He's young. He just became a doctor last year, and he started to notice in his workplace that there were several instances of medical malpractice by his senior doctors. And so my friend called this out because he knew it was right, and he knew that it was part of his professional ethic to uphold the principle of patient safety. And of course they didn't like that, and he got suspended from work, and he was targeted. But the point is, what is the common thread between this and this? I would call both activism, and I would say it's because these types of activism are essential pieces of these people's everyday integrity. My friend's everyday integrity in his workplace, and these people's integrity in doing whatever they do, thinking, okay, this is something we need to stand up for and stand together against. And I would say the integrity question comes into play in both these types of activism. It shouldn't be something that's a separate act, a separate activity that you engage in that's almost the flip side to governance. Activism is not separate from life, but rather it is life itself. And so whatever you end up doing, if you end up being a doctor or a camp counselor or the head of an NGO, whatever you do, activism is what you do within that profession or activity or whatever it is that helps you stand up to old, rotten systems of power. So that's a pretty broad definition. And I would say the main thing I'd like to talk to you about today is the notion of fear. And to me, fear has been a big part of my journey as an activist in the last few years, because I've noticed that it's actually the biggest thing stopping us from achieving the world we want to achieve. Fear has become a motivator for activism. We're told to be terrified of the future. We're told to be terrified of the people around us doing bad things, and that is the fear that's supposed to drive us to action. You've probably seen this before. Organizations whose slogans are something like, "The future is approaching and it's terrifying. Do something, sign up for this cause, join this mailing list, become a volunteer." I was at the UN last year, and I was writing a speech or something, a policy brief, and I was trying to talk about the world I wanted to live in, and the policies I wanted to see passed so that I could live in that world for myself and my children. And a fellow activist came up to me and said, "Hey, we need some stronger language in there." And I was like, "What kind of stronger language?" And they were like, write something like, "Climate change will burn your children to a crisp, and in 20 years, you will probably be dead, or many people in this world will probably be dead." And I thought, okay, that's interesting, because it's true that climate change is a huge issue, and I would know this, and my work has been centered around it for years now. But why do we have a vision of the future as something terrifying? Why don't we have a vision of the future as something positive that we want to move towards and actually be motivated to work towards? Fear, when it's presented to us like that, breaks the connection between natural human compassion, when we connect to an issue, and what we actually do about that issue. It forces us to move forward based on a negative view rather than a positive one. It works as blackmail rather than incentive. And it becomes a club. I've had so much discourse in the climate change work I've done where if you don't show terror, and if you don't show a sort of doomsday scenario for your future, you don't belong in the club. You don't really care about the issue. And I'd really like to fight against that, because I think that undermines the entire notion of activists and of justice, the bottom line, justice. So fear, in addition to being a divider, actually serves to flatten the individual. I honestly believe, as I believe that every human has compassion within them, I honestly believe that each of us is a diverse, complex, multifaceted individual. Each of us is interested in different things. You may have different strengths, you have different weaknesses, you have different interests, and I think those are really flattened in the type of activism that we're called to do in this day and age, where we're asked to plug into sort of a beehive system. We're told, protest here, join this organization, use this discourse, be afraid, work hard, and you're an activist. And I would like to fight against that because we're not a mob. We're individuals within a group. And when you have fear of the future, that flattens us into just the masses. So getting past fear is really important because the type of change we need to see, and we're on the brink of it, we're really almost there, as most of our speakers will attest to after this, the type of radical change that we need to see depends on each person resisting power in their own way, many different kinds of power. And so when you're told as an activist to be busy and to be doing the same types of things, that busybodiness becomes a facade behind which business as usual can continue unhindered. And that's something that we can't let happen as we move into this next new era. So this is not to undermine the really heavy and weighty issues that we're facing in our future. We're youth, and we're going to see a bunch of really, really big changes in our world in the next 20, 30 years in our lifetimes, and our kids are going to be living in a world that's very different from the world we're living in today. And that's a serious issue. But those are heavy, often crippling things. But I would argue that those are things not to be approached with fear, but rather with motivation and compassion and a desire to stand up to power and a desire to maintain your integrity in whatever you choose to do. So I would ask you, before I leave, if you see the future as something like this, if you want to see the future as something like this, or if you'd rather view it as something like this and work towards this, are you running away from this, or are you running towards this? And I think that's a very key distinction to make. So if there's a message I'd like you to take away, it's that, do not be afraid. Stay true to yourself. Don't let fear bog you down. And don't be scared. Yes, we're in a lot of trouble. In the next few years, there's a lot of work cut out for us. But you are a complex and diverse individual. You have a lot to offer. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Thank you.